Okay, off to our last section in the IMRAD format, discussion section. Really sort of the heartbeat of your research article, in the sense that this is where you get a chance to explain to your readers why your work matters and really go and show how it relates to the larger context that you laid out in your introduction, right? And here now you're really kind of showing your contribution. So this is a very important section, and one that I think a lot of reviewers and editors make a lot of comments on, and I think it's because it is so important. And so I see in a lot of responses from editors and reviewers most of the comments for this section, right? Because this is really where the heartbeat of your article lies. So the structure of the discussion section, I pointed this out to you earlier, is sort of the regular triangle, right? We went from the inverted triangle in the introduction to methods and results, sort of here, right, specific, and now you get to the discussion section. So you want to start very specific with the specific results of your study and explain how they answer your research question or questions, or how they address your aims, your hypothesis, whatever structure you used to present your readers with what you're trying to accomplish in your study. So you start specific with a specific result or several results, and why, and what they mean. You want to make sure you support your conclusion, namely the conclusion you make, why this matters. You defend your conclusion, and this is really where you write a little bit about, or I suggest to anticipate criticism. If you were a reviewer of your work, what are some areas you would criticize? Would it be the study design? Would it be maybe a particular, error that occurred as you were collecting your data that you can't do anything about? Don't try to ignore those or think like, oh, the reviewers might not notice. They will. And I think most reviewers' comments I've seen in this section have to do with like finding the issues with your work. And a colleague of mine at Stanford University, who has a wonderful set of videos on scientific writing as well, which I'll post a link to in our resource section, um, in the Moodle platform. Her name is Professor Sainani, and she always says that she has worked as an editor in a couple of science journals. She's a scientist by training herself, and she always says that the best articles are the ones when she's reading the methods and results, and she's already writing down, oh my God, what about this, and this is missing, and this is not, why didn't they do this? And when she then gets to the discussion section, and actually the writers, the authors of that article address each and every one of her concerns. So don't skimp on that. And then you also want to end, you of course want to end towards the broader end of the triangle with the overall implication of your work. What's the big picture? What does it mean to the quote unquote world, right? Why do we care? So let's look at a couple, actually the template structure from my colleague, Professor Sainani at Stanford. There's a link to one of her videos, but again, I'll link to all of them, the whole course she does online, which is great. It's a free online course you can take, or you can just watch the videos. I think the course is offered through Coursera, but the videos are available independently as well on the site that I'll link to in our resource section. I've taken this slide from her presentation because I really think it's well organized. So her suggestion is you start with the key finding of your study. What's the main answer to the main question that you've asked in the intro? So the findings are normal. What does the data mean? You start a little bit of hinting into the big picture, but you stay specific because you're focusing on one of your key findings. And be really clear with we found that, or something similar. Language here really matters. Be clear. We found that. Use that terminology, frequently to make clear to your reader, hey, this is where we're discussing what we found. If you have secondary findings, you want to also write about them in a paragraph or a few, depending on the number of them. You want to make sure that you create a context for these findings. So compare your results with other people's results. Discuss how your findings support or challenge the paradigm in the field. Provide possible mechanisms or pathways. Right? What's the context for the findings you have come to in your study? And this is again where you kind of go back a little bit to the introduction and some of the resources you might have cited in your introduction. Make sure you include your strengths and limitations, right? This is where you want to anticipate the reader's questions and criticism. Very important, as I just said a few minutes ago. You also want to include something about what's next. Something needs to be confirmed, recommend that, point out unanswered questions and future directions, right? So what else could be done to continue having a conversation around this topic that you investigated? Make sure you do include at the end something about the so what, the big picture, and what are the human or implications of basic science findings that you have discovered. And then tell me as a reader why I should care, right? And a strong conclusion kind of goes hand in hand with that. Restate your main finding and give a final take-home message. And I'm going to show you an example from that article from Drug Safety that we've looked at throughout these videos that does it actually pretty well. Before we do that, very briefly, these are some common rhetorical moves in the discussion section, similar to what I've said already, but I just wanted to really articulate them for you in bullet points. So make sure you often successful discussion sections include some way to differentiate your study from existing work. They present key findings of the study. They connect to larger conversations in the field, right? This is all the context that I always talk about, creating the context for your study. They explain implications for the greater good, the big picture, really key. Provide the context for the study's findings based on previous work in this area. Differentiate your study compared to previous studies. Explain how your study fills an existing gap in the research, confirms previous research, and/or expands existing paradigms in your field. And don't feel like you have to do all of these, because depending on your study, you might not be able to all three. Just one of them is fine, but make sure you go to a broader context, broader meaning of your work. And of course, don't forget to list limitations of your study. And in the same vein, going hand in hand with that, suggest avenues for further research, right? So just in a different way, expressed what I mentioned earlier in this slide, or what is in this slide as a proposed template structure. Those are rhetorical moves. And rhetorical moves, I should have explained what I mean by that. It's a term from writing pedagogy. The kind of phrases, the kind of stories you want to tell in your discussion section. So you're making a move about, you have a certain phrase that does any of these things. That's what I mean by rhetorical moves. Those are certain strategies to tell your story in your discussion section. So let's look at the example just to remind ourselves. It's about the study about these TZDs, right? Those two types, rosiglitazone and pioglitazone. I finally am mastering, I think, pronouncing these. Again, the associations between these and any kind in diabetes, in type 2 diabetes patients, or patients with type 2 diabetes, and any kind of issues around the heart, be it heart failure, angina pectoris, stroke, or any kind of attack. Okay, so that's our context. So in the discussion, and I've taken some pieces out here. You'll see whenever I include these kinds of things, it means I've taken out passages because it's a fairly long discussion. By the way, discussions often can be the longest part of your research article, so don't be surprised when that happens. So here in this first paragraph, the authors differentiate their study from existing work very clearly. This observational retrospective cohort study extends the research. So it's not like the total opposite, it just goes further than this particular study. And then right in the second sentence, they go into the key finding, right? Using a large nationwide health insurance database, we found, didn't I just say that? Very clear language. We found greater association between this monotherapy and increased risk of any cardiovascular event. So this is exactly what they were looking for, right? One of those TZDs having a really large effect on increasing the risk of cardiovascular events, like those strokes, angina pectoris, and so on. Okay, so and then in the next sentence, the authors clearly go into connecting their findings, their topic, to larger conversations in the field. Our analysis was consistent with recent studies, right? Hey, this is not totally new. Other studies really show this as well. Ours is just broader and more detailed, and they're differentiate this further. And here, right, in that first paragraph, they're doing a lot of rhetorical moves here, right? The last sentence, these findings provide additional valuable information to clinicians, patients, and the public regarding the safety of TZDs. And anything around the public always has a big picture implication, right? The public cares. Oh my God, here we go. The second paragraph continues their conversation, or continues their narration of why this matters. They continue providing some more context for the study findings based on previous work in this area. Right here's the key phrase: previous clinical trials have generally investigated, and so on. But then they show the difference of their study. However, very clearly marked, our observational study found that only a very small proportion of the patients in our sample actually used either this and this and this and this. Context for the study's findings based on previous work in this area. The next sentence does that. Even in early observational studies, it's difficult to recruit patients. So again, they're writing about previous studies, but always in the context of their finding, what their finding has showed, how their findings are different, which has to do with, let's look at that again. We had the key finding right here, right? It's really about the great association between rosiglitazone monotherapy and increased risk of any cardiovascular event. So the rest of this will show how other studies have not done that and not completely done it. We're skipping a part here, and then another big paragraph that really says something about the unique contribution of the study, again differentiating it from previous research and explaining how the study fills the research gap. So, and I think it becomes very clear in this sentence right here. Let me look for it. So by using nationwide data, we could explore the extent of prescribing for the drugs concerned. This allowed a more in-depth and thorough study design, right? This is how the study is different. It's a much more in-depth and thorough. Again, we're skipping some, and then in the next passage that I've included here, they clearly go into limitations of the study, but they provide a lot of feedback on their findings and kind of connecting it with research, providing that large context. So here, in this paragraph, the study is not without limitations. Very classic sentence that, you know what, you can't go wrong if you use a sentence like this to start off your limitations paragraph. And again, you want to address these because your readers are smart, your reviewers are smart. They will figure it out. And if you don't address it, I think it might not make them angry, but it's like it's an omission on your part. You really shouldn't omit this. So they start with first one of the main limitations, and so on and so on. And this goes on actually for a few paragraphs, or I think it's a couple of paragraphs actually. There's at least 4 or 5, if not 6, major limitations that these authors point out. I just include the first one to show you the language around this. And then lastly, these authors used actually a heading called conclusions for the end of this discussion section, which is not always the case. Some journals don't want it, some journals encourage it, some journals ask for it, some journals don't care. So you got to figure out, based on the author guidelines and your communication with the editor, if you need a heading like this. But if you can, I think it's useful to have that. And so in the conclusion, again, the authors provide a sort of big picture summary of the study, right? Despite limitations, our study of nationwide diabetic populations offers additional insight into the use of TZDs, blah, 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 and so on, right? So this, we've heard all of this before. This is not new, but it's just rephrased, and you really have to do this for your reader. Don't leave your reader hanging with the limitations and it's the end of your article, but wrap it up for them to really bring them back. Hey, this is why this matters. This is why our work matters, right? I also point out further research right here. This point estimate, however, suggests a non-significant association towards a more favorable effect than blah, blah, blah. This indicates an area where further research is needed, right? So, yay, great. Here's some more stuff to do for other researchers. And then at the end, again, they basically rephrase what they've said here and in previous parts of their article, but really focusing on the big picture. Our findings extend the evidence from current literature to a real-world setting, right, the big picture, and support data from clinical trials that disadvantages or harm caused by TZDs, especially rosiglitazone, may outweigh their benefits in patients with type 2 diabetes. So it tells me why it matters and the big impact, the big picture. Okay, so great example. So now go to your next handout. And you guys are going to look at some sections from the discussion sections from the article that Henry and his colleagues wrote, continuing your work with that. And I'll provide a short video going over that as well if you want to look at that later once you've done some work on it.